Hello and thank you for joining us. My name is Ben Sheen. I'm a managing editor here at Stratfor, and I'm joined today by John Minnich, East Asia analyst, and we'll be talking a little bit about China in 2015 and what to expect. So John, what do you think the big trends are that we're going to see from China coming into this year?
Well, there are three things really that we're watching for in China this year. The first is clearly the housing sector slowdown and the deflationary impact that's going to have on the economy as a whole. The second thing is the government's attempt to use the housing sector slowdown as a window of opportunity to push for a set of reforms that they hope will put China on the path to a more sustainable long-term economic growth model. And the third is the anti-corruption campaign, which for the Chinese government really serves two key purposes. One is to reaffirm the public's support for the party, the public's faith in the party's leadership capacity, that the party knows what it's doing, it has the right vision. And the second is to clear away obstacles to reform from within the government and party apparatuses.
Okay, so there's quite a bit there. So looking first at the slowdown in the housing market, how does this affect what the central government's doing and also the provincial economies as well?
So the economic slowdown, really it's not entirely centered on the housing sector, but the housing sector is the heart of it. So this is a sector of the economy that plays an incredibly significant role. It's 15 to 35% of the economy, depending on how you measure it. Yeah. So it's a huge chunk of the economy. And as that slows, what we're going to see is that certain regions, the economy as a whole is going to be affected, but certain regions and certain industries are going to be hit very, very hard. So industries that we're looking at would be coal, steel, iron ore, extractive industries, building materials industries. Those are the ones that are most directly reliant on the housing construction sector. They're going to be hit very hard. And of course, regions that are more reliant on those industries are going to suffer. Yeah. So those are areas where we're going to see some pretty significant potential for corporate debt crises, for local government debt crises, for employment crises, things like that. And this plays out in particular in sort of the relationship between the central government, which has these reform goals, and local governments, which look at those reform goals and say, well, those don't match our goals, which are to maintain high employment, to keep social stability, to keep high economic growth.
So in what ways do you think that the central government and local governments, how might they use the economic slowdown to actually push through certain reforms they've been thinking about in response?
Right. So there are three sets of reforms that the government is looking at this year. The first and by far the most important, but also in a lot of ways the trickiest, the most delicate, is fiscal reform. This is another topic for another discussion, but very briefly, fiscal reform is that is the central knot holding together Chinese political economy today. It's all about the fiscal relationship between different levels of government. And the key thing here is that local governments are very deeply dependent on land sales for revenue generation. Local governments cover the vast majority of government expenditures in China, and they make the money to pay for those expenditures through land sales. And land sales, the dependency on land sales is one of the things that has driven China's housing construction boom over the course of the last 6-7 years. So now as that sector is sliding, the central government is in a position where it has to find a way to create new avenues for local governments to raise capital. And that's where the fiscal reforms come in. The problem with fiscal reforms, though, is that, and by fiscal reforms, we mean primarily creating new taxes, adding new taxes to the economy. The thing is that if you move those through too quickly, if you put too many new taxes too quickly, then you're going to have a very dramatic drag effect on the economy. So the government is in a position where it wants to implement these reforms urgently. It needs to implement them, but it also has to, by virtue of what these reforms will do to the economy, it has to proceed slowly.
It doesn't want to create a shock to the system.
Exactly. So other key reforms we're looking at would be financial reforms. And here the main goal of financial reforms is to find a way to give ordinary Chinese the opportunity to turn their savings into capital, so that ultimately you're laying the foundation for them becoming the domestic consumer base that the government hopes 5-10 years from now will be the driving factor of the economy. And then finally, we have state-owned sector reforms. So the idea behind this is, twofold. One goal is to take industries like coal and steel that have been extremely fragmented, where you have tens of thousands of businesses, many of which are not cost-effective producers, many of which are closely connected to local governments that are being sustained on debt. And the government's goal here is to consolidate these industries under the control of integrated state-owned conglomerates. Another element, though, of state-owned sector reform is to subject these state-owned conglomerates to market forces. So it's kind of to create an environment of controlled competition in a sense. So they do want it to be, they do want these industries to be operating under the control of ultimately large integrated companies that are more cost effective, but they want to subject these companies to some element of market competition. And of course, that in some ways is one of the more politically volatile reforms that we're looking at, because when you take these state-owned conglomerates and you subject them to market forces, well, that brushes up against a lot of the vested political interest within these state-owned conglomerates, who for a long time have enjoyed implicit subsidies in the form of low taxes and the form of, vast amounts of corruption, to be honest.
Completely. And looking at this potential possibility of friction in actually bringing the reforms through, how do you think China can actually bring them to pass? Because obviously the reforms, they might be good for the economy, good for the country, but they're not always going to be popular, especially for people with vested interests or some of the cliques we've seen emerging in central government. Now, there's been a fairly expansive anti-corruption campaign. How is the central government going to use this to its advantage to push through these reforms?
Well, yeah, so this goes back to the kind of multidimensional purpose of the anti-corruption campaign, the functionality of the anti-corruption campaign. So one thing that we've highlighted before is that, this, it does play an important role in mobilizing popular support among the people for the party, especially the central leadership. It gives people faith that the central leadership knows what it's doing, that it has a legitimate claim to rule China, that this is a legitimate dynasty in some sense.
Yeah.
But another important component of that is precisely to, it is a way that the central leadership, Xi Jinping and his closest associates, can go through and weed out, can extricate, can eliminate potential barriers or obstacles to reform from within the party, from within the government apparatus, from within the state-owned sector. So the anti-corruption campaign plays back onto both the economic slowdown and the way that the government is trying to manage the social disruptive effects potentially of that slowdown, but also the idea of pushing through reforms. Well, how does the government make reforms politically viable? It eliminates opposition to those reforms to begin with.
John, thank you for sharing this insight with us today. For more on China, read stratfor.com.